I would like to introduce Braun, Aliki Moncrief, Celeste DePalma, and Houston Cypress onto the stage. Thank you.
Everybody looks. So good afternoon. Hi, my name is Braun. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. I manage our climate and coastal resilience program. Really excited to be asked here today to moderate this panel. We've got some really high-powered panelists working in the field. But before we get started and I introduce our panelists, I'm going to just give a short slide deck to kind of tee up the conversation. Let's see. Which way?
Come on, can we? Does it move?
Excellent, awesome. Okay. Thank you so much. Great. So this panel, we're talking about impacts on Florida's biodiversity and ecology. Really, it's kind of our natural environment. And so we're going to talk about that briefly, but really we're going to move the conversation to solutions, really, natural solutions. And so you don't have to go very far to find information on climate change and those impacts on biodiversity and ecology. And you can look at FWC's website, the Florida Climate Institute's, their climate book, chapter 12. There's a lot of information out there. And so, coastal systems, what kind of impacts are we looking at? Ocean acidification, what that means to coral reefs, habitat loss, those things pop up. Moving on to freshwater wetlands, you see things like, potential nesting failure, habitat connectivity, right? That hydrologic connectivity being lost. Upland ecosystems, also, expected extinctions to increase. Habitat loss again, it's definitely something we expect quite a bit of. Changes in fire season, what does that mean to the natural system? And hydrologic connectivity, that pops up quite a bit. Second, advance the next one. There we go. Perfect. And so we're kind of looking at a bridge, right, between nature and people, essentially. And so there's a lot of challenges, and you've probably heard some information at this conference on how that's affecting people. Habitat. So really, coastal communities, and we say coastal communities, it's really all of Florida. Florida is considered really a coastal community, and we talk to people, and they say, well, it's just the coast, that interface where the ocean hits the beaches or the bay, but really Florida is completely coastal. And so these communities are really facing unprecedented levels of risk due to the onset of climate change and sea level rise impacts. And this vulnerability will only increase due to those impacts you saw on that previous slide, loss of habitat, those things. Because of the damages to natural systems or natural infrastructure. So we've lost something like 85% of oyster reefs, 50% of mangrove cover, 30% of reefs are in decline, and maybe even more than that, and 70% are at risk. So it's really, I argue that these systems really are very important. They're really protecting people, and you can see weather-related disasters cost the global economy something like $300 billion annually. And so there's a large body of work that talks about the protective power of nature, right? And here's a couple of examples. So just coral reefs, for instance, flood damages could increase by 91% globally, and they were talking about $272 billion if we didn't have coral reefs providing that protection. Mangroves protect the global economy from over $80 billion in losses per year. And just in Florida, looking at Hurricane Irma, we have a study that's getting ready to be published that looks at avoided losses. And the conclusion is that the mangrove systems have saved over $1.5 billion in avoided losses just from Hurricane Irma alone. And so we kind of talk about a layered approach for the natural system, and this is kind of an infographic. It's a bit busy. But it kind of, it moves you from the beaches and the reefs to the bay, to the city, and it really kind of talks about the value that nature provides and the solutions and the buffer that it also provides. And we talk, into the city, into the Everglades as well. And in addition to strengthening, essentially, community resilience, nature really has the potential to remove carbon pollution. I think you've heard probably some of that yesterday. In just the U.S. alone, nature has the potential to remove 21% of the nation's carbon pollution, right? That's equivalent to removing emissions from all cars and trucks on the road. And you can see the infographic, forest, improved agriculture, grasslands, and even coastal habitats. Especially in Florida, coastal habitats play a large role. So I just kind of want to tee up the conversation a little bit that way, and now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first panelist and start asking some questions. So we're going to start with Celeste. Celeste DePalma is the Director of Everglades Policy at Audubon, Florida. In her role, Celeste leads Audubon, Florida's efforts to restore the river of grass, along with a talented team of Audubon scientists and policy specialists. Born in Argentina, Celeste has made Miami her adopted city. Celeste is a board member of the Everglades Coalition and recently received the 2018 Everglades Coalition Conservationist of the Year Award for her efforts to protect the Arthur R. Marshall Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. So welcome, Celeste, and I'll start with the first question. So if you can kind of just tell us about your work, whether it's strengthening community resilience, protecting the environment, maybe take 3 to 5 minutes and just kind of give us an overview.
Sure, and I'm very happy to be here. I have to start by saying that it's good to be back home because I actually am a Panther. I graduated from FIU, and I actually see one of my professors here, Dr. Stoddard. Hi. So it's great to be here. So yes, I basically work on Everglades restoration every single day. Audubon started 119 years ago because of the Everglades, specifically because of the birds of the Everglades. We got formed to prevent the wiping of the wading birds in the Everglades when using feathers in women's hats was fashionable. And so we organized. Women actually had a huge role in helping put an end to the plume trade. We passed the model law, which was the basis of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that we have today. And so we thought that we had done everything that we could to save the Everglades. Well, I'm here with you today, so our work is not done. Today, the biggest threat to the Everglades was really the alteration of this unique ecosystem, the way that water used to flow north to south. We lost 50% of that ecosystem to give way to development and agriculture. And so in changing the fabric of what makes the Everglades tick, we saw a 90% decline in wading bird population in the Everglades. So today, we're still here today to make sure that we try to recreate what Mother Nature did best, and in that, make sure that we bring back the population of birds, but also protect our quality of life, because there is no South Florida without a healthy and resilient Everglades ecosystem.
Great, thank you. I think that's a great point, kind of letting nature do what it does best, for sure. Thank you so much. So our next panelist is Houston Cypress. Houston is a two-spirit poet, artist and activist from the Otter clan of the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida. He resides on the Miccosukee Reservation in the River of Grass region of the Greater Everglades. He works on art, conflict management, multimedia communications, gender diversity, these kind of disciplines in the field. So Houston, can you kind of talk a little bit about your work? Take a few minutes and kind of describe it for us. Thanks.
Cool, thank you. I want to talk a little bit more about the Love the Everglades movement, because through that organization, that nonprofit, we inspire action. And the kind of action we're concerned with is toward improving water quality throughout the Greater Everglades by engaging all the communities as possible. And we do this by using a full spectrum approach of all the tools and tactics that are available to us. And so this work really begins by respecting the indigenous communities of the region. So you can sum it up by saying, like, do what you can with what you've got where you are. And a lot of us are artists. So many of us work through the arts. We also work through education and event planning, but let's talk about the arts, because that convening power of the arts has been especially impactful and meaningful for us. We bring people and things together, especially through artists that have a socially engaged practice, a social practice. So we bring people and things together, we bring communities, ideas, materials, and tech together through the arts. Now, we know all the places that art can take us, to events, to communities, to nations around the world, but what is it that we're really communicating through the arts? One of the things that we can talk about, and that we do talk about, is the benefits of fresh water supply. Now, we take a holistic view of these benefits because the limited and the basic view tells us that we should talk about impacts to the economy, of fun in the sun, but why do we always have to boil it down to the dollar? That's kind of boring. Let's bring more poignant lenses and more poignant analyses to the table. Let's invent these. So when we talk about freshwater impacts, we can talk about personal and community impacts and talk about how restoration is bringing these communities back together again, communities that are compartmentalized. So the people that live in these regions, they have science and policies that they're promulgating, the Miccosukee and Seminole people. So they talk about the plants and the animals as being important to their culture. These are the same plants and animals that all of these NGOs and community organizations are talking about and that we love. So these are the things that we have in common. So let's go out there and use all the things that are available to us to really connect with these places. Use the arts, use your senses, use your policies and prayers. Because the indigenous communities, they have science to back up their claims. They have flows and levels documents. They have non-point source pollution management plans. And they have water quality standards. But these are opportunities. This is the good side. This is the rosy picture. There's definitely challenges out there, like the indigenous communities being plagiarized, their laws being ignored. So we can definitely be sober about these things and still have a foundation to build upon. So these interests, these collaborations, and these different ways that we're relating as communities with each other, like these open the door for environmental justice, social equity, and gender diversity. So that's just a little bit of like a broad overview of what we've been up to in terms of Love the Everglades through the arts. And I look forward to collaborating with y'all because y'all have great ideas. So thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. To hear about water quality, connection of people and communities, and restoration, the arts. I mean, all kind of in one description. It's really refreshing to hear that, and I think it really strengthens, people and nature in that way. So thank you for being here today. So our last panelist, Ms. Aliki Moncrief. She's a graduate of Harvard Law School and has worked for a number of environmental organizations, including the Legal Environmental Assistance Foundation, the Florida Office of Earth Justice. She joined the enforcement section of DEP's Office of General Counsel in around 2004. She's also was the executive director of Environment Florida. She led the Environmental Communities Campaign to pass the Water and Land Conservation Amendment, a very important amendment. Currently, Ms. Moncrief is the executive director of Florida Conservation Voters and Education Fund. So, Aliki, would you please kind of talk about your work also? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Well, we got started, you kind of mentioned this, Florida Conservation Voters, we actually got started in 2012 as a coalition of Florida's environmental community to make sure that the state dedicated funding to natural solutions, to protecting conservation lands, making sure that we had money to restore the Everglades, making sure that we could buy more state parks, that we could manage some of the public lands that we already have. What the environmental community saw in 2011 was that the legislature had just been completely slashing funding for these important natural systems, and so they got together and went straight to the voters because they knew that there was a really deep disconnect between what everyday voters expected and wanted and what the legislature was actually doing as a policy matter. So the good news is we won in 2014. Over 4 million voters, 75% of the electorate in 2014 said, yes, we want funding to be redirected. Actually, we want to re-nourish our Florida Forever program and our Everglades restoration efforts. And so we're coming up on the five-year anniversary. I will tell you, the one thing that I've learned in citizens initiatives is that it's absolutely not a silver bullet. You can't kind of rest on your laurels and say, oh, we won, so now we just get to move on and the legislature's gonna implement it perfectly. That has not been the case, I am sorry to report. The good news is Everglades restoration is actually getting a really healthy portion of Amendment 1, so we've got one leg of the stool covered. Land management is getting more money than it had been in the past, so making sure that we can manage our lands that we already own as the public, that's getting well funded. So 2 legs of the stool, we're good. We have one more leg of the stool to go. That's Florida Forever. I'll talk about it more a little bit later. But Florida conservation voters, after we won, we realized that power is in people, and there's power in our democracy. So what we aimed to do is we shifted our mission from a single issue to actually making sure that we elect lawmakers who are going to protect our living planet and healthy communities for everyone. So that's what we do. We get involved in elections. We get involved in voter registration. We make sure that the personal choices that so many of us make, personal sacrifices, personal things to better our world, actually translate into political will from our lawmakers. So that's essentially our main tool in the toolbox. So we can talk about that more. It's an exciting and fun tool to use.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Thanks for your work on Amendment 1 and working on that last part of the stool. That's excellent. Thank you. So there's a lot of recent discussion on how climate change is really impacting our natural environment, and maybe you guys can just touch really briefly on kind of where you see that in the work that you do, and then we can kind of move on to some solutions. But Celeste, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. And I'll share like the perspective that we see in the Everglades, and I'm sure that you can add to that from the Miccosukee perspective, because you guys are there and you live it and breathe it every day. But the things that we have seen on a 3,000-foot level is just the change of the seasonality. The Everglades has, I mean, if you live here in Florida, you notice that we have a dry season and a wet season. Other people have fall, winter, spring. We just have dry season and rain season. And we notice a change in that seasonality. In some years, what you get the reverse, or where you wouldn't get a dry season. You would just have a continuum of the wet season prolonging into the dry season. And that has effects on the way that food is available for birds to actually go ahead and nest. And so we've seen populations of birds decline in years where we don't have that perfect dry to wet season effect. We also see an increase on frequency and severity of wildfires. And we know that with a changing climate, we're only going to see those effects become even more accentuated. So those are just some of the few characteristics that we've seen happen. And then the other thing that we've noticed is that we have wonderful wetlands, but unfortunately, if you don't have water in wetlands, those wetlands become prone to what's called peat collapse. And when your peat collapses, you lose elevation in land. And so you're making it easier for salt water to actually infiltrate. And then you're even more vulnerable to saltwater intrusion. So those are some of the things that we're seeing with our warming climate, with sea levels rising. We noted in Florida Bay, like in the southern part of the ecosystem, between 2001 and 2015, there's been a 5-inch elevation in sea levels. The average in sea level is about 3 millimeters per year. Here in the southern Everglades, it's about 7 millimeters per year. So that's the reason why accelerating Everglades restoration is important. And some people will look at that and say, well, if everything's going to be underwater, then why bother? Well, because we are not even ready for what that looks like. So we need to do the best that we can to allow us to adapt to a changing climate while we combat a changing climate. And we can't slow down. We actually have to accelerate and put metal to the pedal and just keep going. So those are some of the things that we're noticing.
Okay, great, thank you. Houston, do you want to touch on this question as well?
Sure. I mean, a lot of the things that Celeste just touched on, we are already experiencing and noticing and dealing with as well. More intense storms, and rain occurrences at the wrong time of the year. So it seems to be as if things are out of order and off whack. And this whole idea, like, it kind of seems like we are living in the future that you're going to be experiencing. We are living in a situation where our villages are constantly underwater. We are inundated with high nutrient water so that it's almost as if we live in a toxic environment. And even though we try to promulgate solutions, as I've stated, our solutions are ignored. So I think this points to the urgency of creating alliances and friendships with each other to amplify our voices together. So I feel like we are living in a situation that you all are already anticipating. So that's what I would like to share.
Excellent, thank you. I think, you know, kind of tying the two together, really kind of, you know, alliances for adaptation while we kind of battle global warming and the impacts. Yes, thanks. Aliki.
Yeah, I think Celeste and Houston, you pretty much covered all the impacts. I would just underline, you know, how many folks remember the blue-green algae red tide crisis from last year? So there's a pretty direct connection in terms of what you all are talking about in terms of changed weather patterns and a warming climate. These are microorganisms that would otherwise, without the additional water, without the warmer water, and without the addition of pollutants, wouldn't have been quite the disaster that they were. And by the way, I just saw in the news today that they're already seeing blue-green algae microorganisms in the St. Johns River. So we're going to continue to have those kind of eco-crises if we don't get things under control. The other thing, I grew up in Miami, but I live in Tallahassee now, so I love North Florida. St. Vincent National Wildlife Refuge, which is in the Panhandle, they're starting to see mangroves grow there. Kind of strange. So the migration of species, even plants, which I mean, honestly, that's a little bit of a silver lining. I love mangroves. The fact that they could be in St. Vincent National Wildlife Refuge, it's kind of, you know, in a way, a silver lining, but not really, because they shouldn't be there. It's a pretty clear sign that our climate is changing. And then obviously Hurricane Michael. I know that, you know, front of mind for folks down here is Irma. The communities in the path of Hurricane Michael, which was, you know, upgraded to a 5 after the fact, one of the most devastating hurricanes. I drove from Tallahassee to Pensacola a couple weeks ago, and it was over 60 miles on I-10 that you could see trees just flattened. So if you imagine, I mean, communities are still trying to pick up the pieces and trying to restore their lives after the rubble, and they're not honestly getting a whole lot of help in terms of state and federal funding. So just to kind of put a finer point on some of the issues that Celeste and Houston raised.
Great. Excellent. Great, thanks. So next question, talking about climate action, right? And so that can mean a lot of many different things to different people, essentially. And I think everybody on the panel touches one way or another on natural climate solutions. Can you kind of tell me what that means to your organization and how that can inspire other communities to take actions? Maybe Celeste, if you want to start.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that to us, that speaks to green infrastructure. And Houston, you said it earlier, I think, why does everything have to go to money? I think it's just because I need that money so we can put it to good use, right? And a lot of lawmakers think of, oh, we'll just need more pumps and, you know, we'll just pump this water here, pump it over there, and it's gonna be fine. But those pumps are costly. They depend on a type of fuel. They generate emissions, and they become obsolete after a number of years. With our rising sea levels. And so there tends to be like that's the easiest solution, the first thing that people think of in terms of adaptation, but we actually have the best shock absorbers that there are in the planet right here. Wetlands are the best shock absorbers. They are actually nature's best sponges. 1 acre of wetlands can absorb 1.5 million gallons of floodwaters. They are actually our best tool against an incoming storm. And if you think about it, the Everglades used to hug the entire peninsula of Florida. And so when you have an incoming storm, that was the first thing that they would touch. It was the Everglades. Now we ripped up pieces of the Everglades, and the first thing to have contact with that hurricane is your home. And so I think going back to seriously investing in green infrastructure is part of what we've been trying to get that message across to decision makers, because there is a lot of traction when we talk about climate change for adaptation. We still have to do a lot of work on mitigation, But even in the adaptation side, people's knee-jerk reaction is, let's just put a piece of concrete, let's just build a seawall. And we know that here in Miami is obsolete because of the type of soil that we have. You just put a seawall and it's like, sure, that seawall is going to help. And then you have sea coming up on both sides of the seawall. So that's something that we've been pushing really, really strongly, trying to make that connection between mangroves, wetlands, keeping those wetlands, hydrating them, because if you have wetlands but they're not strong enough, then they lose that resiliency factor.
Okay, great, thank you. Houston, yeah.
I remember, I think it was the energy panel, somebody talking about imagination and determination, or was it imagination and commitment? So I think that kind of underscores what we're working with. Imagination is the arts, and commitment is the activism. So let's create colorful alliances often. Alliances that come, evolve, grow, and then go, because they're built for a purpose. So they evolve, and also let them go as well, alliances. What kind of languages and what kind of words are we using to attract friends? That means being open to expanding the discourse as well as the praxis. Revise often, update regularly, be strategic. Speaking of being strategic and action, how many of y'all have direct action training? The next direct action training is going to be in Miami, May 11 and 12, and it's free. I got the details, so let me know. And use these social media to inspire your community, to cultivate your audiences, and to mobilize them. But that means we got to be nice to each other. Emotional intelligence is key. We're all struggling to do our best. So forgive and grow. And we talk about self-care, but it's also us-care as well. So when it comes to climate action, I would propose those as good best practices.
Great, thanks. I love your theme of alliance, alliance building. I think it's really important and powerful. So thank you for that. So Aliki, can you talk about climate action, what it means to your organization?
Sure. Well, in the context, climate action means a lot to us because although we started as a land conservation issue, we do now work on the full spectrum of issues from cutting our carbon emissions. There's kind of, the way I have been trying to talk to folks about climate is it's two sides of one coin. One is adaptation and making sure that we're more resilient and more prepared for the changes that will happen, they're going to happen. They are already happening. That's only one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is making the damage less bad, mitigating. And so we work kind of multiple sides, but because we're talking about natural solutions in this panel, I really did want to sort of plant the seed in your minds about how our land conservation programs really are climate solutions. So, we talked a little bit about Florida Forever. We've been saying for a long time that in Florida, when you protect land, you protect water. Well, it also turns out that when you protect land, you're actually protecting us from the worst of climate impacts. When you protect forests, when you protect actually agricultural lands, and you have programs that are allowing farmers to renourish soils, these are all things that are helped to, in a really overly simplistic way, many of you could describe it way more technically accurately than I can, you're pulling carbon out of the air. And so programs like Florida Forever, which support the rural and family lands, land acquisitions, so that you can keep farmland as farmland and not pave it over and become developed paved areas. Programs like Florida Communities Trust that helps local communities build more parks. And then Florida Forever, there's a whole category of proposed protected lands that are on the list because of the value that they have in climate resilience. So our activism, especially, I have to say, session is almost over, May 3rd, and we're still not seeing this year that third leg of the stool getting funded. Governor DeSantis proposed $100 million. The Senate has proposed $45 million, and the House has proposed $20 million, which is not enough to solve the problem. One other thing I want to remind folks, when Secretary Noah Valenstein was here earlier, he made the case for how we need a climate assessment. There was actually a bill that Representative Ben Diamond, who's out of St. Petersburg, he put a bill forward to basically say, look, We just had the National Climate Assessment. It's a great process. We learn a lot from that. Let's start doing a Florida climate assessment so that we can understand what are the costs that our communities are paying. I loved that Noah Valenstein kind of cheered that concept on. Unfortunately, the bill that I'm referring to did not even get a hearing. So we've got a lot of work to do in the legislature. But we have we kind of go at it in terms of FCV, we go at it from a lot of different angles.
Great. Thank you for bringing up kind of the idea of Florida Forever and the work that Florida Trust does in terms of land conservation, making that tie to a natural climate solution. I don't think a lot of people think about those, those programs in that way, and I think that would really help strengthen it to some degree. So maybe, Aliki, I'll kind of let you continue the discussion. So what are some of the solutions that you're most proud of that you worked on with your organizations or your most recently? And one of the things I want you to address is really kind of like, how do you replicate or scale what you're doing? Because that's a big part of it. People kind of have demonstration projects, they have these smaller things, but the concept is, how do you really scale them, replicate so it has much more impact? Maybe you can.
Well, it's interesting actually because ironically, I think when it comes to land conservation, you can scale up, but you can also scale down in the sense that there are, every ballot cycle, every election cycle, you will see in Florida municipalities step up and create their own mini Florida Forever programs. So oftentimes, in fact, you all might remember, Miami Forever, there are elements, right, of protecting land in order to have resilient solutions. So that's just a recent example. Literally every 2 years, you will see at least 3 or 4, if not more, communities across Florida who step up and do that. So, we think about it in terms of Amendment 1 in 2014. That was just the state. That was a statewide effort. But every community in the state can do their own small version of it, and it really doesn't take as much as you think. It takes a small group of committed people to go and talk with their lawmakers, figure out, do we need to, can the lawmakers just go ahead and put it on the ballot, or do we need to get signatures to put it on the ballot? But that's what I would say, is that we've got to kind of go both directions. We have to go up and be looking at statewide solutions, but then also looking at local solutions like that.
Awesome, great, thank you. Houston, so also, what are some solutions that you're most proud of with your organization, and can you address, what's the best way to replicate that in other communities to see that impact?
All right, cool. So there was a campaign to shut down a proposed bike path through the Everglades a number of years ago. The bike path was called the River of Grass Greenway. And so the opposition to that project was mainly led by the indigenous communities. So that lesson taught us support indigenous leadership. And that was a direct action campaign that took many forms. So nonviolent direct action is a great principle to learn about and to practice. Being open to the spiritual component, although it doesn't have to be at the forefront, I think is just being open to that helps, especially when it comes with indigenous communities or communities of color. That's vital. So that campaign against the bike path was something that we learned a lot from and that we still implement. And then on the art side, there was an art installation that we were also proud of because it brought multiple perspectives together. It was interfaith. It engaged communities by literally helping us get to back country places. So we relied on locals to help us get out there. And the locals educated us on their environmental concerns and their priorities too. So it was great networking and coalition building too. So I think all of those projects still highlights the need for gender diversity because the indigenous leadership were females and women, and that we were proud to support and be led by. And the Inflection Points project was also a project that was highlighting gender diversity from indigenous perspectives too. So I think those are some of the principles and lessons that we learned from the two projects, art and activism.
Great, thanks. So do you have any thoughts on how do you replicate that in other communities, right? How can we expand the good work that you're doing?
Okay, so there are definitely tools available out there like the Beautiful Trouble book by Andrew Boyd. It's available for free download. Its direct action training is good. Get that, read that, implement it, and try your best. Just go out there and try. Yeah.
Okay, great. I love it.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for your positive attitude, for sure. So Celeste, maybe you can take
Sure.
this one.
And I think that the common theme between, the examples that we're giving you is, they're proof that people can actually do change the current status quo. You can actually go out and do it right now. It just takes a little bit of organizing, right? You know what you want to do, then find someone that can help you, then find another person that can help you, and then delegate. Do not try to do it on your own. Delegate. Delegate, and then make sure you follow up with that person and make sure that that person who told you they will help you did what they actually were supposed to do. And that is really the secret, right? I mean, it is a lot of work, I'm not gonna lie, but you can actually do amazing things like Amendment 1. I mean, think about that. That was so much work. That was a campaign in and of itself, and there was so much preparation to it. The River of Grass Greenway was almost a done deal. That was incredible to see, Houston and Betty and so many other people that were going into that migration, basically, and then taking that form of activism straight back into commissioners' meetings, right? Talking with decision makers. And that took people power. Well, one of the examples that I can give you kind of spears a little bit from Amendment 1, but also scaling up. So Everglades restoration, the main thing that drags Everglades restoration down is funding. Everglades restoration is supposed to be a 50-50 cost share partnership between the state of Florida and the federal government. But sometimes you have the state giving more money, sometimes you have the feds giving more money. And so it's like we're never really equally on par. And different funding cycles end up affecting us greatly in how much we can do each year. And so back in 2016, after Amendment 1 was passed, we said, okay, so why don't we try to establish a recurrent set of funding for Everglades restoration so that we don't have to depend on the legislature that tends to change every few years. You change leadership, you have to go and educate the lawmaker, tell them why it's important to put money aside to restore the Everglades, and then once that person gets it, term limits, and then you have to start over again. So in 2016, we worked to pass the Legacy Florida Act, which established a minimum of $200 million going towards Everglades restoration every year from Tallahassee. And that builds on the success of Amendment 1, but we didn't mean take it only from Amendment 1. We just said, give us at least $200 million. You figure out where you need to get it from. Because, by the way, Amendment 1 was not supposed to be the only source of funding for land acquisition. It was supposed to be a boost to general revenue use to do land acquisition. We're still working that out. But, so we passed that in 2016, and that was a huge campaign too, because there were some lawmakers that obviously didn't understand, and they were far removed from the Everglades. So why would they care on putting funding towards the Everglades? Well, eventually we got there. Now we're working on the federal side of the equation. We're trying to say, hey, Florida stepped up. We are putting at least $200 million. DC, you need to meet us halfway. You need to come at $200 million as well. And so that is where we are right now. And that's going to be a huge campaign into the future. Right now, with the president's budget being $63 million, that really doesn't translate the sense of urgency that we do have here in Florida. And so obviously our work continues, but that takes people power too. It's not going to be me, Celeste DePalma, just being, getting those $200 million, I can assure you that much. So yeah, it is doable. And if we did it here in Florida, that gives us hope that, you know what, then it's not so crazy. We could try to do it nationwide, and that's where we are right now.
Fantastic, great. Thanks. I'm so glad Audubon Florida is working on that cost share balance. I think that's really critical that you're really pushing on the federal side. So thank you for that. So, and you talked about urgency, so that kind of gets to the next question. So the recent National Climate Assessment really indicates that there is quite a bit of urgency in the work that we're doing. Can you tell us about some of your, the biggest hurdles that you have, essentially, and is there a way to really speed up the effort? So how do we increase that work? So Celeste, maybe you want to continue? Sure.
I don't want to sound like a broken record, but really money is the biggest hurdle, and not so much money, because there is money. It's just making that connection as to why that money has to be spent. And to all of us in the room, because we're the choir, it's just so obvious. But the other day I was at a meeting and I was talking to a colleague, and it dawned on me. We have, the Army Corps of Engineers is the federal partner in Everglades Restoration, and they have a program that's called the Aquatic Ecosystems Restoration Program. That's basically the pot of money that they use to restore ecosystems nationwide, okay? To restore ecosystem nationwide, they are counting with $140 million. $140 million to protect, conserve, and restore the one resource we cannot recreate. We cannot live without water. We cannot make water up in the laboratory, at least not yet. How much money do we spend in roads? Billions. How much money do we spend in ports, airports? Billions. Bridges? Billions. And yet it is so hard to get 200 million out of Washington, D.C. It's not easy to get 200 million out of Tallahassee. You know, I will not say that that's just easy peasy either. But we invest billions here in Florida in roads every year. And so making that connection, the why, it should be, you know, people should be opening up their wallets to just say, like, yeah, take all my money because you know what? I cannot live without water. So let's do everything that we can to make sure that that resource that we have does not go to waste. And that's what we're doing right now. We're wasting 1.6 billion gallons of water per day that we discharge out to tide. So that is one of the biggest hurdles.
Okay. Great, thanks. So Houston, can you talk about some of the biggest hurdles you face in your work and how do you speed up your efforts, right, in the face of climate change?
So hurdles, so what I hear often is more like an attitude problem. Like, it's not my problem, I don't care, no one listens, the system is corrupt, why bother? Like, that's the hurdle. And like, how do we overcome that hurdle? And so like, that's why we have been using the arts to inspire action. But like, how could we speed up the efforts? Like, you can help us out by integrating arts and faith communities across the board. Like, bring them to the table. Like, we need more artists up here on these panels. And so that would help out. Another thing that can speed up this, the discussion and the action is to honor indigenous sovereignties. And we do that by integrating their conservation priorities. And so I think those are some things that will help speed up my work in particular. And we've heard a lot of great solutions already this morning and yesterday, talking about public transportation and energy consumption and all that. So all of that is definitely good advice. But for me, integrate arts and faith across the board and honor the indigenous communities by integrating their conservation priorities.
Excellent, excellent. I think you kind of speak to kind of reaching an expanded, maybe a new audience at times. So yeah, thank you. So Aliki, biggest hurdles and how do we speed up our efforts?
I think the biggest hurdle is the disconnect that I talked about earlier. It's the lack of political will on the part of our lawmakers, and there's a bunch of systemic reasons for it. I love that you mentioned, you know, people, I think, unplug and feel helpless because they think the system is corrupt, and that's the last thing we want people to do, because that's the only thing that's gonna change anything is people staying engaged. But at least, you know, at the state legislature, it's a very hierarchical structure. And, you know, Celeste, you mentioned roads. Well, it just so happens that this year, the Senate president has a really, he's super passionate about building new toll roads in Florida to connect Tampa to Georgia, and then to connect Central Florida down to Naples and Fort Myers, down through Big Cypress. So when you think about a state where we're not meeting our current infrastructure needs, we're not currently dealing with our issues, and then you find that there's a desire to spend, you know, $45+ million on road projects, that's a disconnect. And so, that is the biggest hurdle. I would say that the ways to overcome that hurdle, you know, it's actually, I'm sure everybody in this room votes. We all have to do that and then some. Like, we all have to really step up our game. Not only do we need to vote, we need to bring people with us to vote. We need to, you know, I know oftentimes people feel like the system's corrupt, politics are horrible, they're yucky, but we have to figure out how to make it fun engage people. I think art is a great way of doing that. I think another thing that we have to do is make it real for folks, because Tallahassee and what happens up there feels very far away. And folks, when they think about voting, they think about presidential election, or maybe they think about their local election, maybe. But that state layer, that's the jelly in the middle of the sandwich, is usually the place where folks are least informed. They don't often know who their state senator or who their state representative is. And these are folks who are in charge of our $80 billion budget, of which only a very small fraction is going to these natural solutions. Just to give you a figure, I was thinking about, NOAA again, Valenstein mentioned the Coastal Resilience Program. Well, the governor has proposed $6 million for that this year. Anybody want to guess what percent of our budget that is? It's tiny. It's 0.0075. And he's proposing $6 million, the House and Senate are proposing less than $3 million. So, something's got to change, and that is the biggest hurdle, honestly. I think we've got to get folks to get past this feeling of sort of hope is lost. We've got to activate, we've got to bring our friends, and we've got to change the political will of folks who are in charge.
Great, thank you. So excellent comments. So really, I think, pay attention to the jelly in the middle. I think that's really important. I mean, Celeste, I think, working with the state to get a lot of funding for Everglades restoration is great. And so, but there's more, right? There's more that can be done. And I think that's a great thought in terms of paying attention to the state on that way. How are we doing on time? Okay, so I'm thinking maybe we can open up to questions at this point. Great. Yes, you'd like to take this one?
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to mention, because Caroline said something, we can run for office, us, the normal people. We can also do our part to just talk to our family, friends, neighbors, coworkers about this. So often we're so afraid to just have that conversation. And if you don't feel comfortable yet talking about climate change, join the Cleo Speakers Network. We will pair you with an expert, we give you all of our slides, and we will get you comfortable speaking about climate change, because one of the biggest hurdles is that we're not talking about it. So I will now open up the questions. Does anybody have a question for our panel? Yes.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Sanchez. I am a sustainability advocate. I'm a Juris Doctor, and I'm also a proud tree hugger. I went to school for environmental and earth law, and my purpose in life is to promote sustainability and environmental advocacy. So I'm going away from the capitalist lawyer kind of dream and going towards a purpose of promoting advocacy. So, thank you. So my question to you is, what best practices would you have for someone like me who would start a small group of committed people to speak to legislatures but can't get the seat at the table because we're not campaign donors?
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the campaign donor thing, and this doesn't entirely answer your question, but I do think that is actually something that more of us need to do. Even if it's $25, even if it's $50, it doesn't sound like much, but it does give you a little bit more of a step in to the campaigns. So part of how you get, your question is, how do you get a seat at the table? You're a constituent first and foremost. That gets you a seat at the table. And I think part of it is being persistent. So when they're in Tallahassee, that may be the time of year that they're least accessible to you, but they're home most of the year. They're only in Tallahassee on and off for committee weeks and then for 60 days during session. So be persistent. I would say one of the things I have found gets more traction with lawmakers is when you have very specific asks. And so I would work with, groups to find, Environment Florida, Florida Conservation Voters, Audubon, we're constantly putting out information, calls to action. I have a call to action for all of you before the end of next Friday, in fact, and that is to, put in a word for Florida Forever and ask for more money. So I think you get a seat at the table when you're persistent, when you make it known that you're a constituent, when you bring people with you, and you build relationships. So you find the people who are giving candidates money. It's publicly accessible information, and you might recognize some of the names on the list, and you might be able to work within your network to kind of find a way that way.
There's also an excellent group, the League of Women Voters. Perfect.
And I just wanted to add, I think you want to, it's another person that you're gonna meet. So build that relationship, right? I think that a little goes a long way. Trying to just, be respectful but be persistent and continue to call. You're likely not gonna get the lawmaker, but make friends with the aides. Mm-hmm. They're the ones that do all of the work. So if you can become a resource to that aide and helping them understand the issue, helping them cut down the amount of research time that they have to do, they'll realize that, they can call you directly and just ask a couple questions. The best thing that you can do is do your homework so that they know that you're reliable. Once you only have one opportunity to kind of damage that relationship forever, and that is if you lie or if you give them bad information, then you lose that little bit of goodwill that you had is gone. But if they know that you're a reliable source of information, factual information, that is so valuable. Because 3 months for a legislative session, I don't even know how they do it. But those aides need all of the help that we can give them. The other thing is, find out if there's someone that you know that knows that legislator directly. In Tallahassee, it happens a lot because Tallahassee is like this big. But you would find that such and such lawmaker is actually going to Orange Theory with you, and you're like, oh, look at that. But maybe there's someone in your group that went to school with so-and-so's daughter, and there is a personal connection that you didn't have before that already puts you in a different light, because all of a sudden you're just an acquaintance that they're going to meet with. So, yeah, you don't have to be a donor, but donating, supporting the people that are good is also good.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for such a wonderful information. My name is Vernell Sybil. I'm a lead accredited civil engineer and is guilty of building some roads. I won't do so anymore. My question today is retreat an option? And if it is, what would the legal landscape look like thereafter or before?
Before my colleagues address that answer, because I'm sure they will have an answer on retreat, as far as the indigenous community is concerned, that's not an option. We're not going anywhere. We intend to stay, and we intend to be a long-term partner in these processes. So don't forget us. Don't abandon us.
And this is why partnering with indigenous communities is so important, especially in water quality issues. So thank you, Houston. Retreat, is that an option? Retreat might be a reality in some areas, like in the Keys. I think the Keys has a cap on how much they can actually build. They have a cap on giving permits to build new homes, because they know that they're going to reach a point in time where it might not be sustainable to maintain those communities, or it might not be wise to continue to add up to that tab to maintain existing communities. It's still a bad word, though. Nobody likes to talk about it. So I feel like we're not there yet, but humans are actually the ones that react when you have nothing else to do. So we might eventually get there. I don't know if you want to add, Aliki, but
I would just add that I think, because you asked what the legal landscape and sort of what the logistics of retreat might look like, and it will be very complicated. I think we actually have an example in a way. When you look at Central Florida, you look at Orange County, Osceola County, and you look at the diaspora from Puerto Rico because of Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma, you are seeing a community in Florida that is having to deal, at least on a temporary basis, with the consequences of retreat. And so when you look at the problems that they are tackling right now as a result of it, they're having an incredible housing crisis. There's not enough space. When folks first came, they also had an incredible they had to ramp up and get kids ready for school. So there was incredible pressure on the school systems to be able to accommodate a really large influx of people. So I think we have some places in our own state and obviously elsewhere in the world where we can look and get a sneak preview of what it will be like, and it will be very complicated.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ashley Young. I work for Our Climate, which is a nonprofit new to Florida, empowering young people to educate both the public and elected officials on equitable climate policy. And we went to Tallahassee April 9th. I was able to organize 40 students along with NextGen to talk with our legislators about acting on climate. And one of the things I kept getting hit with and going to events, I live in Tampa. In Tampa is they're encouraging young people to subscribe to either the Democrats or the Republicans or a particular campaign. And in Tallahassee, they say, oh, if only we got more Democrats elected, or only if, and the Republicans, actually, we didn't meet with the actual staff, we met with their staff rather than the officials, but we tried. And I wonder if you have any advice on what we heard about yesterday, the scientization of politics, and how you approach these campaigns and not in a partisan way, but trying to say that these are facts, these are science, and it's not about a particular party winning, it's about our lives, our survival winning. Thank you.
I'll take a stab at it, but I will say that the politicization of the environment is a very new trend. It didn't used to be like that. In fact, it shouldn't be, right? Because it doesn't matter if you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent. It doesn't matter. Climate change will affect you no matter what party you're from. The same with, blue-green algae. It will affect you no matter what party you're from. You will get sick if you drink that water. So I would say resist the temptation of falling into that being the reality. Ignore it. Breathe, because it is very, annoying. And then try your best to find what is the common ground that you can find with someone that might not have your political tendency and accept your ideas right off the bat. Just find that message. You have to be able to find a way to talk to people and engage them in the issue that you're passionate about. And it might not be through the lens of, always use the facts. But it might not be through the lens that you're used to. It might be through the arts, like Houston was saying. Actually, the arts is a great media because it takes away all of the political differences that we have. It kind of breaks people's walls down a little bit. So find a way to start that conversation and then see what moves that person and build on it. It'll take time, but you can find allies across both sides of the aisle.
Thank you. A great common ground to find is also just ask the adult, do you have children? Do you have young people in your life that you care about? And you start from there. And it's a very different conversation when you make it personal. Houston, you had one comment, and then we have two questions, and we move on.
Just to say that it sounds like some of the things that we could talk about is how we're framing this message. And I really appreciated some of the ways that Celeste framed the message in terms of the Loxahatchee battle, encouraging and inviting decision makers to be the champion for that project. So how are you framing it?
Hi, Phil Stoddard. Very quickly, $25 puts you on a different list. You're now a donor, and you'll get different interest in the future. Anybody who wants to run for office, I'll help you figure out how to do it. But I had a question for Houston. And one of my favorite places to go is the Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge. And before my kids croak, that refuge will be gone. It'll be underwater. But one of the things they did, which was lovely, was on the access to the refuge, they built a bike trail, but it was elevated. It goes over a marsh on skinny little concrete posts. And so it doesn't interfere with the march. It harmonizes with it, and it takes people there without having blocked the water flow. And so my question for you is, rather, if the folks proposing the Trans Everglades Bikeway, instead of proposing more rock infill and paving more of the Everglades, if they had come and said, we're interested in providing access for all people through the Everglades in a non-destructive way, would the tribe and would the conservation groups have embraced that initiative?
I mean, like some of the indigenous communities are concerned that these trails were going to go through sacred sites, and so they'll probably be concerned about that too. How do we avoid sacred sites? Then that points to, like, we have to identify these places, and now the public knows, and they can go desecrate it on their own. So, like, making these things public is very difficult for us to talk about. And when we talk about elevating roads, yeah, who knows? It would have been a nice conversation to have, wouldn't it?
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry, but we got to stick to the time schedule. Thank you to our natural environment panel. And now we're almost at the end.